Good to see you.
Votre power est là, ouais, ça j'ai vu un peu mais je savais pas envie de sélectionner la caméra, j'ai pas vu.
Non, moi non. Ça fonctionne pas, moi,
Je pense que vous avez du lousse, là, je l'ai amené à votre gauche, mais on pourrait
Non,
tirer le fil.
non, c'est correct. C'est bon dans le cabane.
Ouais, non, c'est ça, mais sous la table, vous avez du lousse.
Merci beaucoup.
OK.
Bon, je sens moins de pression. Alex, nice to meet you. Thanks for organizing everything. And yes, I got the forms. Yes. Yes. Take over. We'll see how it goes. I'll sorry? Thank you so much. Thanks for all of your help. But I will try. All right. Yeah. Mostly they were in French, but I think there was a law who did the presentation in English.
No, it's not.
I don't know. It's right down for me.
I will make your email. I just have to wait. To enter. You are doing
Oh, really?
You'll present this here and it will be in English? So I happen to know how well, the perspective of I know it's the actually, there was a good water. Yeah, but she didn't come because she had COVID. Okay. But yeah, they're supposed to have options.
Okay, so we are going Okay, so we are delighted to have Alex here, who's visiting the center for the day, and he's going to give a seminar now. So Alex actually is originally from Denmark, from the beautiful city of Copenhagen. He did his studies as a political scientist in Copenhagen, then worked actually a bit in the parliament in Copenhagen. As a political advisor for the Liberal Party. And then after that, Alex went actually to do his PhD at LSE with a mix of economics and political science. Left after for a postdoc at and is now actually for what 5 or 6 years professor at the art school at the University of Chicago. Alex work is on the effect of media and money on elections and accountability. His work is empirical, and he has a specialty writing very, very long period of time for the data. I'm always fun of him because it comes with data of 1 century long, so it's pretty content. So you have 45 minutes for presentation, following the rules of the center. So there will be a 45 minutes presentation. The questions are kept for the Q&A after. So if you have questions, clarifying questions, possibly during the talk, otherwise you can after the speaker. Okay. So
thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, and if you have any clarifying questions, if I'm not being precise or anything, please let me know. Yeah, thank you so much for everyone for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here. I think I've told Arnaud before that people often ask me, "Are you from Montreal?" I think because I have this weirdly spelled French last name that's kind of French, but not really, and I speak with an accent that's not quite American, but has a little bit of a European flavor to it. So people all the time ask me, "Are you from Montreal?" So it kind of feels like being home here. So today I'm going to talk about a question about representation. So my research agenda overall is about how political institutions shape representation, and to some extent how sometimes institutions distort representation. And today I'm going to talk about how thresholds of representation affect legislators' behavior. But in a way, you can think about this as being a topic that is about the core of what we think about when we think about representative democracy. So in a way, representative democracy is the core idea in representative democracy is the idea that groups of individuals, they select some representative to serve on their behalf or to represent their interests in the political process. And in order to be elected, you need a certain level of electoral support from the constituents. You need some level of support from the people that you're supposed to represent. Now, whether a representative needs support from a large group of citizens or only a small group of citizens, that varies across institutional contexts. So you have some political institutions in some settings where you can get elected with only a relatively small group of support from a small group of individuals. And in other institutional settings, you need support from a large group of individuals. So for example, think about majoritarian systems versus non-majoritarian systems. Or think about single-member districts versus multi-member districts. Those create different need for different sizes of individuals that you need support from in order to represent people. So what you might think of is whether that's an institutional choice. So whether you have you need support from a large group of individuals or you need support from only a small group of individuals, that might change, potentially could change the incentives and the selection of politicians. So you can think about, for example, if we take a simple principal-agent framework, you can imagine in that setting that whether you have many principals or you just have a few principals, that might shape the behavior of the agent. So basically in any delegation situation, whether if you have many people that you're serving or just a few people that you're serving, that could potentially shape the behavior of the agent. And in a political context, you can think that the politicians that are selected, if you're selected in a place where you have a relatively small group of individuals, that might give you different incentives, and that might lead to a selection of a different type of politician, compared to the setting where you need to basically please a large group of individuals. So the idea is that you can imagine that if you just have to please a small group of individuals, then that small group of individuals might select a different type of politician than the places where you need support from a large group. And similar, if you're thinking about electoral incentives, and you know that you're being elected by a small group of voters, your incentives might be different compared to a scenario where you need support from a large group of individuals. So one way to think about this, or to summarize this, would be to think about the threshold of representation. So what do I mean by threshold of representation here? Here, when I talk about the threshold of representation, I'm thinking about the vote share cutoff, the vote cutoff, that determines whether a candidate wins office or not. So you can think about this as like the support you need in a particular district in order to get a seat. So this threshold of representation will indicate whether you need support from a large group of individuals or a small group of individuals. So in a plurality system, for example, the threshold of representation will typically be smaller than in a majoritarian system. In a plurality system, you can get elected without necessarily having a majority of the voters. So you potentially need to please a smaller group of individuals in order to get elected. So lower thresholds mean that you need only a small group, support from a small group to stay in office. High thresholds mean that you need support from a larger group of individuals to stay in office. Now the question is that I'm going to try to address in this paper is whether this threshold of representation, whether that influences how politicians behave. Does it matter whether you have to please a large group of individuals or a small group of individuals? Does that change the type of politicians that we select and the type of work that they do? So the overall research question is, how does the threshold of representation shape legislators' parliamentary activities and re-election campaigns? I'm going to try to look at these two aspects, like what do the legislators re-elect? What do they actually do once we've elected them? In the scenarios where we have a high versus a low threshold of representation. And how does it change what they do in their re-election campaigns when they try to get re-elected? Okay. So these are the two dimensions I'm going to look at. Now to shed some light on this, in this paper I'm going to look at some evidence from Japan. And I'm not a Japan scholar. The co-author that I'm writing this paper with, Dan from Columbia, and he's a Japan scholar, so I've learned a lot about Japan since I started working on this project. But the idea is we want to use this evidence from the Japanese context to shed light on this more broad question about how the threshold of representation shapes the behavior of legislators. So why are we interested in this context here? So there's an interesting, Japan is an interesting setting to study this question because they have reapportionment of seats in their system. So they have a single non-transferable vote system. I'll come back and talk a little bit more exactly about how that works in a second. But the idea is that they have a system, and the key thing is that they reapportion the seats every now and then, and that follows a certain set of rules. That means that you have some settings. It's court-driven reapportionment where seats are taken from some districts and reallocated to other districts, following a very rule-based approach. And this means that sometimes you have a district that used to, for example, have only 2 seats, and now because they're following these rules, you end up with an extra seat in that district. You have other places where maybe you had 3 seats before. Now we're taking 1 seat away from them here. And you can think about what happens when you do that. Well, if you're a legislator and you're in a place where you used to have just 2 seats, and now we add an additional seat to that district, all of a sudden you think about that's an electoral cushion for you. And the question is, that changes the electoral threshold, lowers the electoral threshold, basically. And you can think that might change the behavior. It might change the incentives of legislators, because now they're not pressured in the same way electorally. But it might also change the selection. like the individuals, now you could basically imagine a situation where the voters, there might be a small group of voters that can get their own, elect their own representative, whereas before maybe you needed to appeal to a broader group of individuals. So I'm going to exploit these court-induced reapportionments, where seats are taken from some districts and reallocated to other districts. Because that's a way of thinking about how, when you add seat, you lower the threshold of representation. And I'm going to implement a difference in differences design. Of course, so if we just thought about like, where do we have many districts, where do we have many seats in a district, where do we have few seats in districts? Of course, that's not going to be random. That's going to be very systematic, correlated with lots of things. But the thing we want to exploit here is changes in the number of districts. Comparing the same district over time, observing what happens when you add an extra seat to a particular district, and see whether legislators in that district change their behavior relative to other districts. So to do this, implement this different design, we collected a new data set on parliamentary activity and re-election campaigns from historical records. From not quite a whole century, but half a century at least here, from 1965 to 2016. And we're going to look at all the legislators that were elected in this period here. So let me just give you an overview of what we find in this paper. So we find that when you have a lower threshold of representation, that reduces legislators' activity, both parliamentary activity and their re-election campaign activity. And so in particular, what we see is that if you lower the threshold, that induces legislators to participate in fewer meetings in parliament and work on a smaller number, more narrow set of agendas. And what we're going to show is we're going to show that the mechanisms that are driving this effect is an electoral selection mechanism. You select different types of individuals when you lower the threshold of representation. That's the first finding. The second finding is that when we look at what legislators do to get reelected, we see that when you add an extra seat, so you lower the threshold of electoral representation, you see that they also reduce their activities in elections. They reduce their campaign spending, and they start to spend, in particular, reduce their spending that's something that are tied to particular geographical areas. And this effect, I'm going to show you, is driven primarily by electoral incentives. I'm going to try to disentangle to what extent these effects are driven by selection and incentives. Okay, so that's the overall idea of what I'm going to do. So let me first give you a little bit of background of this case. So what is the setting I'm studying? So in Japan, we have a single non-transferable vote system. And the single non-transferable vote system is an electoral system where you have multi-member districts, and every voter has just one vote. So you can basically vote for any candidate you want, but you can only cast one vote. And then suppose that it's a two-member district, it's the two candidates with the most votes that get elected into parliament. If it's a three-member district, it's the candidate with the three candidates with the most votes that get elected into parliament, etc. So you can think about, it's a pretty simple system. It's basically the same rule that you would have in a first past the post. In the first past the post, the district magnitude would just be 1. Here you can extend it to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever you want. So we're going to use data from both the lower and the upper chamber here. And so in the lower chamber, we're going to use data from 1967 to 1993. In 1993, there was a big reform from single non-transferable vote to single-member districts, and they changed all the boundaries. So we basically can't use the information after 1993. But we can use them in this period here. So we have about 130 districts with a district magnitude that varies between 1 and 6. In the upper chamber, we can use the whole period. Here we have 147 councillors that are elected using this system. Then they have another, on top of that, they elect some other legislators using a PR system. And here, they're elected in prefectures. You can think about that as states or provinces. We have 47 of those, and here the district magnitude varies from 1 to 5. Okay, so that's the basic setup that we're going to use. Now, the idea, like, so how can we, like, why is this a good case? So the reason why this is a good case to study, we're interested in figuring out what happens when you see changes in the threshold of representation. Is that here, reapportionments, they happen regularly, but they happen in a way that's very good for this setting. In particular, the geographical boundaries of the districts that I'm going to study remain fixed. So the boundaries are fixed. There are a few exceptions, and we show that when there's a change, we just treat it as a new condition. So that is a tiny number in the big picture. So in general, the boundaries are fixed. And then on several occasions, seats are reapportioned. So basically taken from one district and added to another, in order to make sure that there's not too much of a disproportionality between the different districts. And this system of reapportionment, one concern you could have is like, well, are the politicians just doing this strategically to benefit themselves? That would be a concern. That's like a big concern in many places. Think about the US, for example, how state legislatures are drawing boundaries and adding seats into this. That's a whole mess. Here, there's a nice, clean way of assigning these seats. This is a court-driven system, so the courts set up the rules that were going to be used. And it's a rule-based system, so there are rules that we can observe. What are the rules? They basically just implement these rules. And it's largely a depoliticized process, where there's a this is not politicized in the way that you see in the US. It's basically delegated to a commission. They tell you where should we take the seat from, where should we add it to, following these rules, and then that's implemented.
Just
clarification, please.
So these rules, they're based on like population size?
Yes, I'm gonna tell you exactly what the formula is in just a second. But here you can see illustrated the changes, where we see changes in the number of seats. So here, this is the lower chamber here on the left. Here you can see there were a couple of seats that were districts that gained a seat here. Here there were the districts that gained seats, 8 districts that gained a seat, 8 districts that lost a seat, and the same thing here. And the same thing in the upper chamber, you can see where are the districts that gain a seat, the districts that lose a seat, where in terms of time that happens. Okay, so now we have these events where districts are being taken, or seats are taken from one district and added to another district, and that changes the threshold of representation in these districts. So why were these seats reapportioned? Why did they reallocate these seats? So in 1964, the Japanese Supreme Court established that, I'm not going to do it in Japanese because I can't, so I have the translation here. It is desirable under the constitutional principle of equality under law to allocate fiat seats to each electoral district in proportion to the number of electors. So they set out the general rule, the Supreme Court sets out the general rule for the level of disproportionality between the different districts. And in particular, they set out very specific mathematical guidelines for how to do this. So what they do is, they basically, for each chamber, they calculate a disparity ratio. And that disparity ratio is, imagine we take all the seats in the chamber, or the districts in the chamber, and then we take the population in that particular district and divide it by the number of seats in that particular district. And then you do that for all the different districts. And And then you take the maximum of that number you get and divide it by the minimum number you get. That's what they call the disparity ratio. And so in a world where we have like exactly the same population in every single, per seat in every single district, that number would be 1. And in a world where there are some places where you need just a small population to get a large number of seats, you would have a high disparity ratio. Yeah. And then what the Supreme Court is doing is it's setting out what they consider to be constitutional acceptable levels of imbalance. So they're setting out specific numbers that they say this is a level of imbalance that we think is constitutional, and if you're above this level, it's considered unconstitutional. And in particular, they interpret this in the lower chamber as the ratio of 3 to 1. So if you have a number here that's above 3, then it's unconstitutional, and we need to reallocate seats. In the upper chamber, that number is 5. So you can think like, where did they get these numbers from? And for the purpose of this paper, it's not super important where they get these numbers from. The important thing is that they follow a particular rule. This is the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution, that if there's a level of imbalance that's greater than 3 to 1, then we should reallocate seats in the lower chamber, and 5 to 1 in the upper chamber. And the general method that they do when they reallocate the seats here is they simply take a seat from the district with the lowest population to seat quotient, and then they add it to the place with the highest population to seat quotient. And then they recalculate the disparity ratio, and if it's still above 3, you repeat, calculate the disparity ratio again, and repeat until you're down at a level below 3. So the stages of the process is the following. First, the Supreme Court, as I've already said, they interpret the imbalance in the seat allocation is unconstitutional using these disparity ratios. And then if they think that this is unconstitutional, then there's a reapportionment committee that drafts up a proposal about how we should reallocate these seats. And then that proposal is sent, it's basically a bill that's sent to the Diet, and then they approve it. Okay? So let me give you an example, just to make sure that we understand how this works. So this here is an example from the lower chamber in 1986. And on the left here, I'm showing the pre-reform disparity ratios. So what does this mean here? Here on the y-axis, we have the district magnitude, so the number of districts you have the number of seats you have in the district. And down here we have the disparity ratio, so that's the electors per seat in the district, divided by the minimum electors per seat. Okay? What you can see here, so here the gray crosses are the unaffected districts, so the places, each point here is a district. Over here you can see all the gray crosses are the places where there are no effect. They were not affected by this. The squares are the places where they take a seat away from, and the rings are then the districts where they add another seat. So what are they doing when they get this information? Well, what they do is they start by taking, okay, we can see this district here is the one that has exactly 1. We can see we're above the 3 ratio. So that means we need to reassign some of these seats. So we take a seat from the place with the smallest ratio, we add it to the one with the largest ratio. And then we recalculate. So you can see what happens is that basically disappears here from 3. So we take a seat away from over here. That's going to be one of the dots over here. And then we add it to the one over here. You're going to see that's going to jump up, and now they have an extra seat. And then they redo that process again and again until you can see we've now reached the point where we're below that threshold. And now they say, okay, now we consider this to be in line with the Constitution. So it's a very rule-based and simple approach. So the reason why it's a good thing it's rule-based is that means that that there's less is less of a concern that there's strategic consideration going on where the politicians are trying to add seats to benefit themselves. Here, they're just following this mathematical guidelines that the Supreme Court gave. Okay. So the data. Let me talk a little bit about the data here. So what I'm going to do is we need some information about, like, so what we want to do is we want to see what happens in the places where we add another district, another seat to the district. What happens to the legislators in the place where we take a seat away? So the outcomes that I'm interested here is parliamentary activity and re-election activity. And so we collect the universe of legislators, information on the universe of legislators from 1965 to 2016. And for the parliamentary activity, what we do is we look at their attendance and the agendas that they're working on. So we have all the different, basically we can observe every single committee meeting or meeting on the floor that you participated in, anything where there's like taking minutes from, we have that. And we can observe what do you do in those particular meetings, and what is the agenda on in this particular meeting. And then we have measures on the election activity, re-election activity. So here what we do is we collect information on itemized campaign spending. So here you can see this is one example of this, where we have all the different individuals, and we know exactly how much money they spend on their re-election campaign. We know exactly how much did they spend on advertising, how much did they spend on hiring staffers, etc. So we can get a sense of whether they change their campaign activities when we change this threshold of representation. Okay. So that's the historical data. So just to give you an overview of what this data looks like. So this here is the new data on parliamentary activities. So here, each dot on the left over here, tiny dot, represents a legislator in a particular year. And so this is showing the parliamentary meetings that you attend per year as a legislator. And here the blue dots represent the upper chamber, the red dots represent the lower chamber. You can see the averages here. And then you can see over here the different things, the different agendas that they're working on: budget, tax, agriculture, foreign affairs. You can see the different things that they're working on. And so the idea is to try to see whether there's a shift in like how often you participate in meetings if we now add another seat to your district, and do you start to work on fewer agendas, for example, or a larger number of agendas when we change this electoral thing that we add another district, another seat to your district. The same thing for the campaign spending. Here, this is showing the campaign spending for each individual in the data set, the total level of spending per elector. And over here, we have the disaggregate, how like the campaign spending is disaggregated, like how much they spend on printing and staff, lodging, facilities, etc. Okay. So this data set here, in this data set here, each row is going to be, yes, we have a panel data set. So that means we track the same individual over time. And we have about a little bit more than 6,000 legislator session observations. Okay, so we observe the same legislator in a particular, over multiple time periods. And we're going to exploit that panel structure of the data in a differences design. So the idea is to set up a design where we want to make sure that we never compare across districts. We never compare across districts. What we want to do is we want to compare the same district, the legislators in the same district, before and after we add the extra seat. So for the first, let's focus on this one up here. That's the baseline specification. So what we have is we have an outcome that measures the activities of the legislator I in constituency C at time t. And then we have constituency fixed effects. So that means a fixed effect that will wash out everything that's constant within a particular constituency. So you can think about there are some things that are fixed over time in a constituency, like where is it located, like the type of the industry to the extent that that doesn't change over time. All these things that are that we believe are somewhat constant over time will be washed out by those effects. And then we have time fixed effects. That means that everything that's like a shock that hits all legislators in the same way over time will be washed out. So you can think about like the things that are like changes in the overall economic situation that might influence the behavior of legislator, or yeah, anything that changes legislators' work overall. And then we have the treatment, if you will, that we're interested in, which is the kind of the number of seats that we assign to constituency C at time t. So this here, in this first specification here, we're kind of imposing a linearity here, assuming that there's some linear function of the number of seats. We could also do that without imposing this linearity, and just say, well, we could estimate these effects separately for like the effect of having one seat, 2 versus 1, 3 versus 2, etc. Basically do that for all the different number of seat combinations you could have. But otherwise, the same basic setup. So the main difference is here, there's just a dummy variable for each number of seats. So in a difference in differences design, the key identifying assumption that we're making is a parallel trends assumption. So what does that mean? That means that we have to assume that in the absence of treatment, the treated group and the control group, well, so the treated group, the ones that experience a change in the number of seats, and the control groups, the groups that are not where there's no change in the number of seats, that in the absence of treatment, they would have followed the same trends. That's the assumption that you're going to have to make. And one way to shed light on it, you might have concerns about that in this particular setting, reasonable concerns about that. Because you can imagine, of course, it's not going to be random where you get these extra seats and where you take them from. That could be related to changes in population in particular. If you have places that are where people are moving into, that's going to be an increase in population, and that's like could be a concern for trending. So one way to shed light on this parallel trends assumption would be to look at implement an event study design. So here, what I'm doing is I want to basically estimate the effect and look at whether there's a change between the treatment group and the control group before the treatment is assigned. If we observe that they're starting to trend differently already before the treatment is assigned, that's a concern. That tells us that something, then it's not plausible that they would have not, that they wouldn't have it's not plausible they would have followed the same trend after the treatment. So that's one way to shed light on this. And we can relax the parallel trends assumption in other ways to make it more credible. But here the idea is, suppose that we create a variable that just measures whether we add a seat to a district or we take a seat away from a district. And then we have a dummy variable that's just indicating whether it's L elections since you gained a seat and we code it up as 1, or L number of elections since you lost a seat and we code it up as -1, otherwise 0. And then you run that with all the data and estimate that. And then we can plot these coefficients, and we can observe whether we observe any effect in the pre-treatment period. If we do that, that's a cause for concern. Okay. So let me jump to the results, and we can take a look at the results and discuss these results. So again, the two things I want to look at is whether when you add an extra seat to a district, does that affect their parliamentary activity? Do you attend more meetings? Or do you work on fewer or more agendas? And the second thing is I want to look at re-election activities. So here, we're going to measure that by the level and the composition of their campaign spending. And first, I'm going to show you the results, the overall results, and then I'm going to try, in the next step, to try to disentangle the different mechanisms, whether it's selection, incentives, or experience that are driving these results, or learning. So first, let me show you the results of attendance. So here on the left is this dynamic specification where we can look at what happens in the pre-treatment period, and then at time, between time -1 and 0, at time 0, the treatment kicks in. That means that's where you now reassign the seat. What you can see here is that in the pre-treatment period, there's basically no evidence of pre-treatment trending. There's no statistically significant. They're not trending statistically significantly from each other, the treatment group and the control group. Once the treatment kicks in, then we see over time that there's a drop in parliamentary attendance. So down here we have the number of elections, or the elections relative to the change in the period where we add the extra seat. And on the y-axis, we have the estimated effect of getting an extra seat on the log of parliamentary attendance. That means that in terms of the magnitude, you can interpret this. So here, if you had an effect that was about 0.2, you could roughly interpret that as a 20% drop in the number of meetings that you would be attending. So the effects are not trivial here. When you add an extra seat to a district, on average here, we're up and talking about almost a drop in 50% in terms of the number of.
So this is within career, so people are elected for 10 terms, or this is across.
So this would be basically there. You're right. There would be some of these individuals. Not everyone would be in the sample for the whole period. There would be some individuals here that are perhaps only going to be, they're not going to be the full sample. So some of the majority will be concentrated around this period here, for sure. But there will be some of them that serve for like
the coefficients are estimated based on those who serve. If you look at term number 5, then it's people who've been around for.
Yeah, for sure. These are the ones that are basically in office.
The ones who lose elections.
Yeah. Yes. Well, no. So wait. No. Sorry. I'm going to come back to that point. Whether you actually. So this is at the district level. So this is observing the district. The average level of productivity of the legislators in the district five elections after. But the other comparison is important. I'm going to come back to that. Now, wait a minute, clicker. Here. Okay, and so on the left here, we have the parliamentary, the effect disaggregated by the number of seats. So over here, you can think about what this is doing here. Here, we're basically assuming a linearity. When you add extra seats, it's not obvious that you get the same effect going from 1 seat to 2 seats as you would when you go from 5 seats to 6 seats. So we can disaggregate the effects here and estimate them all compared to the single member district, basically. And you can see here that there's probably an effect, and the effect is probably biggest for this when you add at the beginning when you add extra seats. And then when you add go from 5 to 6 or 4 to 5, the effect is smaller. But when you go from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3, the effect is substantial. So that's the first result. The next result looks at here I look at the effective number of policy agendas. So what do I mean by that? The effective number of policy, you can think about, since I know all these different categories of what they're working on, I know how many meetings do you participate on that's about taxes? How many meetings do you participate in that's about agriculture? How many meetings about energy? I have all these categories, and that means I can calculate the share of your participation, how that falls into different type of meeting categories. And then based on that, you could calculate the effective number of agendas that you're working on. You could also just count the number of agendas if you do that. We get the same results, basically. And you can, then what we can see is, do we observe a change in how many agendas you're working on when we add an extra seat to the district? Because you can imagine some story that, well, now I can get I used to like have to like appeal to both like the people working in factories and the farmers because I needed 50% of the vote. But now we add another seat to the district, I can actually get away with only appealing to the farmers. So now I'm not going to show up to the meetings that's about agriculture or whatever working conditions in the factories. So what we see here is that when we add another seat, there is a reduction in the number of agendas that legislators are working on. You basically see that you narrow in, there's a level shift, a level drop you work on. You have participated in fewer meetings, and you work on a more narrow set of agendas. Okay. Then so that's the first thing. The second thing we can think about is then, okay, do we observe a change in their campaign activity? And if we look at this here is showing the effect on adding an extra seat to the total number of to the total amount spent per elected. And again, here you can see what happens in the pre-treatment period. More or less, it seems to like there's not much going on. Once the treatment kicks in, that means once we add an additional seat, you see that there's a drop in the total spending per elector. So here's about a 4 yen drop per elector. Yeah.
Just a clarification. You drop from the sample the district that they lose a seat, or you have them in the sample?
They're in the sample as well. Yes. So they're coded. So here they're coded as -1. And if you lose a seat, you're coded. If you win a seat, you're coded as +1. We could also estimate them separately, but then when we get more noisy results of that, you could do that as well.
And if you drop them, the results are very different?
Yeah, no, you can drop them as well. You can estimate them separately, and it'll look very similar. Well, it'll look like this when you add a seat, and it'll look like this when you gain it. Sorry, it'll look like this when you get an extra seat, and it'll look like this if you lose a seat. If that makes sense. So here,
Makes sense.
okay. Okay. So this here means that what this suggests is that when we add an extra seat to the district, so we're lowering the level of representation. That means that legislators now spend less money on their campaigns. And again, you can think about some story about, well, maybe I know now I can get reelected. I don't have to appeal to 50% of my constituency. I can get elected by just like appealing to 33% of the constituency. So maybe I don't have to spend as much money. I don't have to send out the material to everyone. I can just focus and target the ones that will get reelected. And maybe that's why you see a reduction in the spending. So to shed a bit more light on that, we can look at the disaggregated spending. So we have all of these spending returns where we know how much money did you spend on facilities, how much money did you spend on ads, how much did you spend on lodging. We have all that information. So we can basically do the same thing, run the same type of regression, but do it separately for each of these outcomes. And then we can plot these outcomes here. So this here is showing the effect of the constituency gaining an extra seat on the MP's campaign spending, the yens spent per elector, by these different expenditure categories. And what we see is that this drop that we observed here is primarily driven by changes in the amount of money you spend on facilities and staff. So you can think about definitely facilities. That's probably something that's geographically tied. So facilities here is like renting headquarters in different offices in different parts of your district. And what you see is maybe they're targeting geographically their campaigns as well. They're like saying, okay, there are certain areas where I don't even need to campaign anymore. I'm going to focus on this area here and just like spend all my money here. And then all the places where I used to have offices because I needed voters from basically all over the place, I'm not going to spend any money over there anymore. Okay, So these are the overall effects. So overall, what we see is that there's a drop in the legislative activity, both in Parliament and in their re-election campaigns once we add an extra seat to the districts. So now let's try to think about why is that? What are the mechanisms that are driving these results? And I'm going to try to shed some light on 3 of these different mechanisms. So you can think of, I've already alluded a little bit to them. We talked about there could be selection effects, there could be incentive effects, and there could be maybe some learning effects too. So when we add an extra seat to the district, what I've shown, the results I've shown so far is basically just taking the average of performance of the legislators in the district. But there are different things that are changing. When we add another seat, we might get, the new person we're selecting might be a different type. Maybe that's what's driving the results. It could also be that, well, we're changing the incentives of everyone, because now you can get away with just appealing to a smaller group of voters. That could be another channel. Or it could be something about learning or experience. Now we have, like, we've added another seat, we elect a new person, that person comes in and doesn't have any experience. That could be driving the results as well. And the baseline estimates that I've shown so far is like kind of showing you the joint effect of all these 3 forces. So let's try to separate these effects from each other. And we can separate these effects from each other if we believe that there's, by modifying the fixed effect structure, if we believe that this experience is constant across individuals. So everyone, like, sort of have the same, like, you learn in similar steps in terms of, like, how many times you've been re-elected before. And the selection effects are somewhat constant within individuals. So, like, we're thinking about types that are constant within the individuals. And if we believe that these mechanisms here are additive separable, so they're basically adding to each other, not interacting with each other. If we believe this, then we can separate these effects apart using the fixed effect setup. So this is what I'm doing here. So the first set of results are showing the effects that we presented so far. So here, this is the results related to campaign spending. So in the first setup, we basically just have district fixed effects and time fixed effects. Okay? And what we see is we have about 4 percentage point drop. So that's basically what we see here, more or less on average. Okay? So now what we can do is, well, let's add fixed effects for experience and see whether there's a change. It could be that the new people that we elected, maybe they just have less money to spend because they don't have as much experience raising money. If that's driving the effect, then when we add experience fixed effects, that should be washed out. Then we should see a drop in the effect. We don't see a drop. So the difference between this effect here and this effect here is just the experience, because we're adding experience fixed effects. So it's not experience that's driving the effect, because these numbers are basically more or less the same. Then the next thing we could do is we could say, okay, instead of just having district fixed effects, we could have district by legislative fixed effects. So what does that mean? That means now we're comparing the performance of the same individual before and after. So we're tracking the same individual, and we're now adding a seat to this legislator's district, and we can see, do we observe a change in the same legislator's campaign spending when we add this extra seat. And what we can see is that this result is pretty much, for all practical purposes, the same. Definitely doesn't go down. So what this here is telling us is that this whole effect on the campaign spending side is driven by incentives. Legislators, they don't have, once you add an extra seat, you lower the threshold of representation. You don't have incentives to spend as much money. So everyone is changing their spending, reducing their spending, and it goes through this incentives channel. Then we can do the same kind of exercise, but with the meetings in Parliament. And here, the outcome is the total number of meetings. And again, let's look at compare the first set of results That's telling us that when we add an extra seat to the district, then on average, we observe a drop in the number of meetings you participate in about 20%, 20%. Okay? But then the difference between the first and the second here, again, the next one, we now remove experience by adding experience to that. And the results are pretty much the same. So it can't be that the experience is driving the fact that we now elect a new guy, we have a new person that has no experience, and he has that time to learn everything. That can't drive the effects. That's washed out by the experience effects. And then in the final period, or the final column here, we then add individual by district fixed effects. And what we see here is that the effect size drops quite dramatically. From negative 24 to basically, yeah, there's still an effect, but it's tiny and not statistically significant. So what this here is suggesting is that here there's no difference, and here there's a huge difference. So the main effect that's driving this result is selection. That's the difference between this column and this column here. So overall, what I'm trying to do in this paper, trying to show that I collect this new data on the universe of candidates in Japan, and I use this identification strategy that's based on these court-induced apportionments, where courts decide we need to take one seat from here and add it to here. And that gives me some leverage to say something about how the threshold of representation affects the behavior of legislators. And what I show is that when we lower the thresholds, when we add an extra seat, that reduces legislator activity. And in particular, parliamentary activity is reduced through this selection mechanism, where we see that legislators attend fewer meetings, and they work on more narrow agendas. And re-election activity is reduced through an incentive mechanism, where when you add an extra seat, legislators, including the ones that have been in office the whole time, everyone reduces their campaign spending. And these, in particular, the reduced spending that's tied to geographical location, such as rented facilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we have time for a little Q&A. So we use my privilege as the host to ask the first question. So you interpret your result as being the effect of having to persuade fewer voters when you add one more seat on the selection of the incentives.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, so I don't know much, I'm not very familiar with multi-member like district system. I was wondering if that would be an alternative explanation related to maybe like when you are the single representative of your district, you have maybe more prestige or a bit more informal power, so that you're the only politician who can, for instance, like build relationships with local special interest groups,
Yeah.
things like that. And then so when you add a new seat to my district, that kind of kills a little bit this prestige or like informal power benefit.
Yeah.
So I work less because now so either I work less because just the utility for like being re-elected is a bit lower.
Yeah.
Or like if I'm a very positive politician, I have more outside options.
Yeah.
I lose my prestige, so now I just go work in the private sector.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I think there might be something to it. I mean, one thing in that story, I would expect that you can think about that as a way of changing the incentives as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that you're basically just here, like some of the benefits doesn't come through like the parliament, but like the prestige you get in your district. But it's still about, you think about it as changing the incentives, that you're now like people don't like you as much, or it's not like you're like the one that everyone thinks is the most important person in the world. So in that sense, I think that you can think about that as being part of I think about that at least as being part of the incentives channel. But I think it's an important story. And you can also imagine that there might be some, when you add an extra seat, like you're creating some free rider incentives basically for these legislators. Where if you're just like, you're the only one that's elected from a district, then basically the voters, if you don't do anything good for the district, the voters can blame you, and they know it's that you were the one who was supposed to bring the goods to us, and we didn't receive anything, so we're going to blame you. And maybe when you start to add multiple districts, another interpretation would be that, well, now you're starting to create this collective action problem. And I think maybe that's what we're hinting to. That's a slightly different interpretation than the one about the threshold of representation.
Yes, because then there would still be the effect of adding more seats.
Yeah.
But imagine like if your story is about like how many voters you need to convince,
Yeah.
going from a majoritarian to a plurality would may not have the same effect.
Yeah.
Holding the number of representatives.
Yeah, I think that is another valid interpretation of the results. Yeah, I think both. I don't have any good clean way of like separating those in any particular clean way. So, but if you have any ideas, I would be interested in hearing it. But yeah, I think it's a good point.
Okay, well now I think anybody can just raise your hand if you have a question, and I just let you pick your
Shoot.
Okay, I have a sort of a follow-up on point that was made and a separate question on spending. So for campaign spending, how much of the money that's used by politicians is determined by the central party? And say if you have 3 or 4 seats within a district, how much common office space would candidates from the same party pull together, which would kind of, in my view, sort of, yeah, that you have more seats, you spend less, but is that per candidate, or it's all the candidates of the same party, and where is the money coming from?
Yeah, yeah. So the results here is the per candidate spending. And one thing that's we don't know a lot about where the money is coming from. So they have very good information on how the money is spent, because they have campaign spending limits, and they need to audit and make sure that they are not like spending above the limits. So we know exactly how they spend the money, but we have little information about exactly where the money is coming from. It would be awesome if I could see like how much of this is coming from the central party, for example. But so anecdotally, at least, the people I've talked to people that work in the electoral administration in Japan. I had a student who actually brought my attention to this data here. And he's saying that most of these campaigns are financed by, you raise money from local businesses and local individuals. So there's not so much that it's money that's funneled from the central party to the individual candidates. But what the central party is doing is it's strongly encouraging the candidates, when you have 2 candidates from the same party, to try to basically split up the district geographically and have them campaign in separate areas of the district. Because here now you have incentives as a party. You want to make sure that you want to get as many individuals elected from that district that you can get away with. So you want to make sure that they don't start to steal votes from each other. They should steal votes from the other individuals, because it's not a proportional system where you get the seats in proportion to the number you get. It still has this plurality flavor to it, where you want to make sure that suppose you have a 3-member district, maybe you're thinking as a party, I can get away with getting 2 seats, 2 individuals elected. You want to make sure that they're not competing against each other, so they end up maybe not winning a single seat and the other parties coming above you. So what they do is, at least anecdotally, they cut up the district into different parts, and then they say, you campaign here, you campaign here. That way we make sure that you don't steal votes from each other. And that's kind of consistent with this idea that at least they stop hiring these offices in different parts of the district when we add another seat to it.
And so on the legislative activity, how much is legislative activity a function of geography? So if you're representing, it's it was mentioned earlier, if you're representing a small district in the middle of nowhere, you may have to have some committee assignment, which will make you more likely or be a backbencher. And if you represent an urban district know, at least in Canada, if you're an urban representative, you're more likely to be named a minister than if you represent a rural riding. So I think that, I'm just wondering, it's sort of, it seems that your argument implies that whatever you're representing is sort of almost randomly determined in attribution to speaking time and legislative activities.
Yeah, so I think that's a very important point. And the way I try to address that in the paper is by having these, all the time, all analysis is done within the same constituency. So all comparisons are made in the same constituency before and after, because you're absolutely right, there are going to be some constituencies where they're just like, for whatever historical reasons or geographical reasons, you will just have more important individuals that are selected in these areas. There for sure will be some geographical variation in that. And that's why it's so, if we just compare it across constituencies, the results would be, haunted by that kind of selection bias. So the way I'm thinking about it is what we're doing to make sure that all comparisons are made within the same constituency before and after. At least the things that we believe are constant over time, like geographical factors, should be washed out.
So you need a representative from District 8 to represent whatever interest in Parliament.
Yeah.
And you go from 1 to 2, then you can say like, well, we have two MPs representing A, so now we can either split the time that they should talk about whatever. So it's within district, but it's also sort of a
so the effects are showing it the per person number of meetings that you participate in. Right. So that means, of course, if you add another seat to the district, you get another member elected. That means in total, the aggregate level of the time that your district gets will increase. But if you think about like the proportional to how many individuals you have, there's actually a reduction. The reduction in the number of meetings that each individual that you're representing is participating in. Sorry.
Really cool talk and interesting point. I think overall, what you found is entirely plausible. Maybe first comment is sort of building up the first point that Jean-François made. I think it would be really interesting to know what part of this is driven by districts now having multiple MPs from the same party, and what part of it is separate from that, to distinguish that a bit more, because it's almost mechanical if it's just more people from the same party within the same district. I think it would be interesting to know to what extent results from even generalized to other settings where we don't have this particular kind of like system. The second point relates to the parliamentary attendance findings, which are plausible to me, and I guess they can be interpreted as the MPs shirking if voters actually pay attention to parliamentary attendance and sort of reward and punish politicians based on what they see there. If not going to parliament is compensated by doing more constituency work, then that the attending less parliamentary committee meetings would not really be recognition.
Yeah, I think those are good comments. I think that's definitely something we should look at, like whether the effect. Imagine estimating this for places where you have multiple individuals elected from the same party, and compare that to places where you don't have individuals from the same party. I think that's a very good suggestion, and that's for sure. That's will help us interpret the results. So in particular, in the Japanese case, is the LDP. That's like it's basically the only party that has multiple candidates from the same party. But it could be relevant to see whether the effect is primarily driven by the LDP or it's also from other parties. And then on the other point about how like the change in the legislative activity. So how should we interpret that? So I think it could be that voters are not actually paying any attention to this. So first of all, the results are primarily driven by let me just go back to this. the change in the activity in Parliament is primarily driven by selection. So I would interpret that as slightly different as like from the shirking. I would think about that as being parts of the incentives that everyone, now you don't have incentives anymore to work hard. So like you're just gonna like do less. That would go through the incentive channel. But here the results actually suggest that most of it comes from changes in selection. The difference between these two columns is that here we're comparing the same individual before and after we add an extra seat. Here we're comparing basically the whole district before and after. And here we observe a drop, here we don't. This is telling us that the effect is probably primarily driven by changes in the new individuals that we select. So the new individuals we select, they tend to do less work. And I can see different stories for why that might be the case. So one story could be, maybe one story could be about the quality of individuals that you're selecting. So the story could be that since now we're spending less money on these elections, maybe voters are less informed about the candidates. And the candidates still think, well, I can get away with like not spending any money, so I'll just do that. But voters have less information. So maybe they select lower quality candidates, and that's why we observe an effect on selection. That would be one story. I'm not sure that I completely buy that story. It depends. You definitely need to believe that money, campaign spending influences whether you can select quality candidates. I'm not completely sure I believe that. Another story would be something about specialization instead. So what we have here when we measure the total number of meetings is in a way, it's not obvious that attending a lot of meetings is necessarily a good thing for a legislator. Like you could imagine that like we have these legislators that if they have to serve a lot of different constituents, they both have to please the farmers and the oil people and like lots of different constituents. Maybe they're just like they're attending all these meetings, but they're not really very well prepared in any of the meetings. But maybe now that we add an extra seat, you know, okay, I can get away with just pleasing the farmers. So I'm not going to go to all these other meetings. I'm going to go just to the meetings that's about agriculture, and then I'm going to spend my time preparing for those meetings instead. So I'll come to these meetings and I'll be able to help the farmers in my district, but not all the other individuals. And that would suggest that it's not necessarily a bad thing that we have observed this drop. It's simply that you now specialize in the particular group that you can get away with representing. But yeah, good, very good. Thanks for the comments.
Thank you for that presentation. I know more about Japanese politics now. I believe that your argument makes a lot of sense, well, makes more sense in a context where the resources of the MPs and political parties are limited. In the case of parliamentary activities, I do understand that resources of the MPs are extremely limited. They have 24 hours in a day, so the number of meetings they may attend, the number of issues they may be attentive at is limited. What about campaign spending? To what extent in Japanese politics, to what extent is our financial donations to political parties, to what extent is that regulated? To what extent the amount of money I'm allowed to spend in a campaign is limited? Is it strictly regulated or not so much?
So it's campaign spending is regulated, but it's regulated on the spending side. So in that sense, it's kind of like the UK and Canada, if I remember the rules correctly. They're definitely spending limits in Canada as well. I can't remember whether there are donation limits as well. So in Japan, it's regulated on the spending side, but not on the donation side. So that's why I can observe like how much they spend and what they spend it on. But I don't really know exactly where the money's come from. So I don't know whether they're funded by one particular interest group or where it's coming from. And the spending limit is typically binding to most candidates, but the spending is substantially higher than the spending you would be allowed to have, for example, in the UK or in Canada. But it's lower than the US, but that doesn't tell us very much, since it's not regulated in the US.
So, I have really two questions. The first one is, what happens in terms of the number of candidates? So when basically you add a seat or you add a seat, does the number of candidates randomly increase or decrease?
Yeah.
Because one of the big problems and one of the reasons why the Japanese got rid of the SMTV thing is that there was the question for the parties, is how many candidates vote and so on.
Yeah.
So can there is something going on that
yes,
side?
for sure. So yeah, so when you add an extra seat, you see an increase in the number of candidates that are running.
And then what's basically the re-election chances of the legislature change or not? Does it increase on this?
So if you add an extra seat, then you'll see that on average, candidates you're gonna see an increase in their probability of being re-elected. Because it's basically this argument that you add a cushion to their seats, and you don't have to worry.
So the new competition is not so much. So there is an incumbency advantage.
Yes, for sure. And then you basically get more secure if we add an extra seat. And then Tim, so you can think about like, what is it that they're fighting about? They're fighting about the marginal seat. When you add an extra seat to the district, then there's the candidate that used to be the marginal, just the last guy who just got elected. Now he can relax a little bit more. And then the fight is between the new last guy and yeah.
And the other question is a bit related to the question before. Is about the whole of party and in particular the allocation. So can it be simply that they spend, for example, less time in parliament because when you add a seat, that allows basically a greater specialization, for example, on topics, then basically they say, well, within the district, the topics or their interests, the constituent of that district, we can now spread them between more people. And basically, we can also basically ask some of the legislators from the district to do more party job and so on. So in other words, is it voluntary that they reduce their parliamentary activity, or is it basically something played by the parties?
That's a good question. I mean, to some extent, some of it is the party has some influence. Party leadership will have some influence. For example, they have some influence over who gets to sit on what committees and who gets to speak on what topics on the floor. Even of course, everyone would be allowed to speak on the floor, but de facto, the party has influence over who gets to go and speak. So in that sense, they do have some influence over that. But I do think it reflects something about your willingness to work on a particular agenda, whether you show up to. So what I'm basically looking at is just whether you show up to a particular committee meeting. And if you're willing to show up to a particular committee meeting, it reflects something probably about your interest in that particular topic. So I believe it reflects something about this, because you can imagine that they have some influence, the leadership. They assign what committees are you on. But still, even suppose you're assigned to 3 different committees, you could decide yourself, okay, I'm not going to show up to one of them. I'm just going to focus on the other 2, show up to all of those meetings. And in that case, that would still be picked up. So I think it reflects something about how they allocate their time. And what we see is this reduction in the number of agendas. So it's an interesting question about whether you would see a change again if you had 2 individuals from the same party, and suppose that we knew how many agendas they're working on before. Now we add an extra seat. Do you see that they're changing? Do they basically split the agendas up? That would be an interesting. We haven't looked at that. That would be an interesting idea to look at. Yeah, I like that idea.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, but.
very interesting presentation. Just building off the earlier point about casework or constituency work by MPs or representatives. I just want to ask if spending would be the best measure of campaigning in that sense, because just because a campaign is spending less, it could be related to factors such as different parties running different candidates in the same district. But in the same way, just because a candidate is spending less doesn't mean they're campaigning any less. They could be doing quite a bit of activity there. Would there be any way to see, I know I'm very unfamiliar with the Japanese case, but to use examples from here in safe seats, oftentimes they'll send MPs to other ridings just because they don't need to campaign.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Yeah, so of course there are limits to like what do we think about, like what exactly does campaign spending measure? Is it a good measure of their activity? I don't know, probably it definitely reflects something about what they do, but you could imagine that they could also be substituting between different types of campaign activities. Maybe you spend less money because now you do other things instead. Maybe you do more constituency work, or maybe you focus more on like going to meetings and stuff. Some of this stuff will still be captured. Like for example, at least if you want to get reimbursed for like transportation costs and lodging and stuff like that, it should be in some way built in the estimates. But there could definitely be it's a very narrow view of what campaigning is. And ideally, I would like to know exactly where do they go, what exactly do they do. That would be awesome. But yeah, it's difficult to get that information even for like elections today. Going back to the 1960s, that's like impossible to figure out what a candidate for the parliament did in that particular campaign. So I think this is probably the best way we can measure campaign activity. But yeah, I would be interested in if there are other ways that you could. We thought about whether we could get kind of like something similar to what Carolyn has information on, where you have the information on the platforms. I think that's like the ideal.
Works on Japanese manifestos.
Yeah. So the problem is if you want it at the individual candidate level, going like far enough back, then it becomes like tricky to get that information. They didn't collect that in the same way they did in France. So yeah, but that's a good point.
Sorry, just to add on to that.
Yeah.
In the case of the manifestos, if you're able to get manifestos at least for a certain time, that might actually help you towards the point on specialization on. That would be an interesting measure to have.
I agree. I mean, I think it would be great if we know exactly what it is that the platforms they're campaigning on. Yeah, I think that would be very, very good. Yeah, I'm not sure I can get it, but if I can.
Any more questions? If not, I think we can conclude on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We have a little gift for you. Oh, wow. Which is the tradition in the center, and the tradition is that the person opens the gift.
Oh, wow.
No pressure at all.
Wow, this is exciting. I've never like received a gift. Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much.
So now, I believe.
Thank you, Alexander. And